In early May 1942, the Japanese plan to widen its defensive perimeter was launched. They seized the Solomon Islands. Two days later, the Japanese carrier force entered the Coral Sea in preparation for the main assault on Papua New Guinea. But this time, the Americans had anticipated them. Admiral Nimitz had ordered 2 US aircraft carriers and a number of smaller warships into the area. For 2 days, the rival fleets searched for each other. Then, on May the 7th, US aircraft located and sank the Japanese carrier Shoho. The Battle of the Coral Sea was underway. Early the following day, the Japanese responded, unleashing a hail of torpedoes and bombs. To begin with, the US aircraft carrier Yorktown managed to avoid the Japanese torpedoes. But then she took a bomb which penetrated 4 decks before exploding. 37 men were killed. The larger and less maneuverable carrier, Lexington, was also hit by several bombs as well as 2 torpedoes. She developed a heavy list to port. The Americans returned fire, attacking the Japanese carrier Shokaku. The first US raid was blunted by Japanese Zero fighters, which forced the US Douglas Devastator bombers to drop their torpedoes too far out. All the torpedoes missed. But a second wave of US dive bombers struck home. The Shokaku's deck was so badly damaged, she could no longer be used by aircraft. After 2 days of fighting, the 2 forces finally disengaged. That evening, the Lexington, still afloat, suddenly erupted in a huge explosion. There had been an undetected leak of aviation fuel that had caught fire. Amazingly, all but 215 of the nearly 3,000 men on board were rescued. Later that evening, an American torpedo scuttled the burning hulk. The Battle of the Coral Sea was, on paper, a draw. Each side had lost one carrier and had another severely damaged. Strategically, however, it was a major US success. It had prevented the Japanese from seizing more territory, and it had stopped them from isolating Australia. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked a new era in naval tactics. It was the first major sea battle in which the opposing ships were completely out of visual contact. It was fought, instead, by aircraft flying from carriers. It would soon become clear which side had adapted to the new form of naval conflict more successfully. By the late spring of 1942, Japan and America were deadlocked. Japan needed a quick victory if it was not to be ground down by the huge resources of the United States. In mid-May, it began its next move. US codebreakers reported Japanese plans for a new attack. It would be on Target AF, somewhere in the mid-Pacific. The problem for the Americans was that they had no idea where Target AF was. Could it be a reference to Midway Island near Hawaii? An ideal jumping-off point for another attack on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor? The code-breaking team suggested a way to find out. The US Air Base on Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message reporting problems with the island's water system. Almost immediately, the code breakers intercepted a Japanese signal that Target AF was having water supply problems. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew exactly where the enemy would strike. The Japanese plan was typically complex. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific would draw away part of the US fleet, while Midway was seized by an occupation force. The Americans would be obliged to hurriedly commit their carrier force to retaking the island. There they would be annihilated by a huge Japanese naval presence, including 4 large aircraft carriers. It was the second Japanese attempt to wipe out the US Navy in the Pacific within a year. Forewarned, the American carriers left port and moved to a position where they could ambush the Japanese. On June 3, 1942, Japanese forces launched the expected attack on the Aleutian Islands. Nimitz didn't respond. Then, early the next morning, the main Japanese carrier force launched a first airstrike on Midway Island to soften up its defenses. US warplanes from the island intercepted them. Most were outdated Brewster Buffaloes and were easily shot down by the more agile Japanese Zero fighters. But the Japanese attack had been blunted. Midway's defenses had not been broken. The Japanese commander, Admiral Chuiki Nagumo, faced a difficult decision. He'd kept some of his aircraft in reserve, loaded with munitions designed specifically for attacking ships, just in case the US fleet was spotted. Should he now order this reserve to be stripped of its torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs and reloaded with high-explosive and fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway? It would leave him ill-equipped to take on the US Navy, but he calculated it was a risk worth taking. Then, just as the reloading was underway, he received unwelcome news. A US naval force had been spotted. Was this the US carrier force, or a smaller, less significant fleet of ships? Nagumo was in a dilemma. Should he continue with the second strike on Midway, or should he once again re-equip his bombers to take on the US vessels? Nagumo decided to gamble. He would push ahead with the second strike on Midway. His hope was that when the bombers returned, there would still be time to rearm them to take on the US ships. Even as he weighed the odds, the Japanese carriers were attacked by US bombers. Every available Japanese Zero fighter was scrambled before the US bombers were repelled. Then came another report from reconnaissance planes. The US force did indeed contain aircraft carriers. Nagumo was, once again, on the spot. His aircraft were halfway through reloading, but the US carriers were a much more important target. He took a second gamble. He decided to change their weapons yet again to attack the US force. But while he did so, his ships would be sitting ducks. Almost immediately, they came under attack from low-flying US torpedo bombers. But they were old and slow and attacked without fighter support. As they approached the Japanese fleet, they were rapidly shot down. For a brief period, it looked as though Nagumo's gamble had paid off. Then, just as his bombers had been reloaded and were ready to take on the US carriers, disaster struck. US dive bombers, approaching unseen at high altitude, hurtled down on his ships. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Nagumo had gambled once too often and was now at the mercy of American air power. Within 5 minutes, the US dive bombers had reduced 3 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers to flaming wrecks. All would later sink. The fourth carrier, the Hiryu, had been masked by a rainstorm, and that afternoon mounted a desperate counterattack. The US carrier Yorktown was severely damaged. It was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine several days later. But the Japanese fight back was short-lived. Late in the afternoon that day, the Hiryu was also hit and turned into a blazing pyre. In a matter of hours, Japan's mastery of the sea had been destroyed. The attack on Midway Island had achieved nothing. But it had cost Japan its finest carriers and 332 aircraft. Well over 2,000 sailors had also died. America now ruled the waves in the Pacific. Yet Japan was still undefeated on land and a powerful threatening force in the air. In the coming months, it would try to maximize these advantages. By summer 1942, Japanese plans to build a defensive ring of occupied territories around their homeland had still not been completed. Heavy losses at sea had frustrated their attempts to grab Papua New Guinea and islands in the Central Pacific. Japanese planners now came up with a new plan. If they couldn't do it by sea, they'd do it by land. On July the 21st, a division-sized force of experienced jungle troops landed on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. They immediately struck west to capture Port Moresby, the capital. Progress was swift at first. The small Australian defence force was completely outnumbered. Within weeks, the Japanese had captured the main pass over the Owen Stanley Mountains. They then halted to await reinforcements before the final push on Port Moresby. The Australians also mustered new forces. When the Japanese moved off again, they now met much stiffer resistance. For the first time, Japanese troops were up against men who matched them for training, experience, and morale. The Australians stood their ground, and the Japanese were temporarily brought to a standstill. But conditions in the jungle were appalling. There was constant tropical rain. Malaria was rife. The Australians were eventually, again, forced to retreat. After 2 months of grim fighting, the Japanese were within 30 miles of Port Moresby. Then, finally, US reinforcements arrived. Through September and October, the Japanese were, in their turn, forced back. The Japanese made an heroic but suicidal stand. Many chose to die fighting rather than surrender. It took the Allies another 2 months before the Japanese were finally overwhelmed. It had been a bloodbath. "15,000 Japanese troops had embarked on the operation. Only 3,000 got away. The Japanese were in trouble. They'd lost at sea. They were now rapidly losing the initiative on land. American military might was asserting itself. There was only one alternative left: air power. Through the summer of 1942, Japanese engineers began building a string of airstrips across the Pacific. One was on the island of Guadalcanal, in the southern Solomon Islands. It was particularly well situated to threaten US convoys heading for Australia. It would become the focus of an epic battle. In July 1942, an amphibious force of US Marines invaded the island. They landed without resistance. The plan was to capture the half-built airstrip, complete it, and then turn it into a US base. But the Japanese were not ready to give up. That night, they sent in a naval force to land reinforcements and to attack the fleet of US ships supporting the Marines. In a dazzling display of night fighting, the Japanese cruisers sank 4 Allied warships and drove the rest out to sea. The Marines were now marooned, without supplies and without much of their equipment. They dug in around the airstrip. Despite constant bombardment, using construction machinery left behind by the Japanese, they pushed ahead with the completion of the airfield. Two weeks later, a group of US Wildcat fighters and Dauntless dive bombers flew in. They were not a moment too soon. The next day, newly arrived Japanese troops launched a series of suicidal attacks on the airstrip. Over the following months, wave after wave of fanatical troops were thrown into the battle. By the winter of 1942, the two sides had fought themselves to a standstill, both now dug in to defensive positions. Then, in December, the exhausted US Marines were replaced by fresh troops. US soldiers now began a new push on the increasingly isolated pockets of Japanese resistance. By early February 1943, the Americans had finally won control of Guadalcanal. They had now beaten the Japanese at sea and on land. They had even denied them access to the air. The Oriental Blitzkrieg had failed. The Japanese Empire now faced a foe that was still growing in strength at a rate it could never hope to match. It was the beginning of a fundamental shift in the course of the war.